What dark family secret were you let in on once you were old enough? The birthday I didn't know wasn't just mine. When I turned 7 years old, my mom and dad gave me the kind of birthday that little kids dream about. They flew me out to Disneyland, and I still remember stepping off the plane, full of excitement. The first day or two in the park were magical. We rode the rides, ate all kinds of treats, and I was having the time of my life. Everything seemed perfect. But then something changed. My parents started taking phone call after phone call. They looked tense, whispering in corners and walking away from me a lot. I could tell something was wrong, but every time I asked, they'd smile and say it was nothing, that everything was just fine. I trusted them. After Disneyland, instead of heading straight home, we took a little detour. They surprised me with a couple of extra days at a huge water park, farther from where we lived. At the time, I thought it was just more birthday fun. I loved every minute of it. That trip stayed in my memory as one of the best birthdays I ever had, and for a long time, I never thought twice about anything being off. It was not until I was about 17 that I finally learned the truth. One night, my parents sat me down and told me what had really happened during that trip. On the day I turned 7, my dad's brother, my uncle, tried to end his life. He had taken a rifle and shot himself in the stomach. He was struggling bad. No job, addicted to drugs, flat broke, and full of pain. He saw my dad doing well, living the life he always wished he had, and I guess it pushed him over the edge. Somehow he survived. My parents did not want to bring me back home while all of that was going on. They figured taking me to the water park would keep things feeling normal, at least for me. And looking back, I realized they were right. If they had told me the truth back then, I probably would have thought I caused it somehow. You know how kids are, we think the world spins around us. But they let me keep that birthday as mine. Just mine. And I am grateful for that. What I was never supposed to know. Before I ever came into this world, my parents had 2 other children. I did not know anything about them growing up. Turns out, my mother had a complete mental breakdown one day and drowned both of them in the bathtub. That was long before I was born. She had a history of mental illness even before that happened, but somehow, she still got released and went on to have me a few years later. When I was almost 2 years old, they had another baby. A girl. But I never met her. I never even saw her face. She was gone from my life before I ever knew she existed. Neither of my parents ever brought any of this up. Not once. I only learned about it years later, after one of my aunts passed away. She had left me some of her personal belongings, and while going through her old keepsakes, I came across a couple of birth announcements. 2 of them. Names I had never heard before. My siblings. That was the moment everything shifted. I always felt like my aunt had left those for me on purpose, like she wanted me to finally know the truth. I asked my parents about it, straight up, but they shut it down hard. Would not talk about it. No explanations, no conversation. Just silence. Some years later, I took a trip back to the town where I grew up. I went digging through old newspaper archives with a friend of mine. We found the date, and sure enough, the story was there. My friend was shocked. Me? Not so much. Growing up, I was always scared of my mother. Her fits of anger were terrifying. I spent most of my childhood walking on eggshells, just trying not to set her off. I cut off contact with them the moment I was able to. It was not just because of what I learned, though that sure made it easier. My childhood was filled with its own kind of damage, and I had been carrying those wounds for a long time. Looking back now, I truly believe it was a huge mistake to ever let them try raising another kid. Some people should not be parents. Not ever. The lie behind the window bullet. My mother was raised down in the southern part of the United States. Growing up, she told me her brother had died in a strange, random accident. She said a stray bullet had come through a window and killed him. Since they lived way out in the countryside, I never had much reason to question that story. It sounded tragic, but believable. Years later, after my grandfather passed away, I ended up inheriting one of his old keepsakes, a Korean War officer's sword. I thought it was pretty cool, a piece of history, something worth holding onto. But when I showed it to my mom, she completely lost it. She got real nervous and insisted it was dangerous. Said we needed to either sell it or keep it locked up in a safe right away. That reaction struck me as odd. So I went to my dad and asked him what was going on. He did not say much, just gave me a heavy look, the kind that says more than words ever could. Eventually, I got the truth. My mom's brother had not died in any freak accident. Back in the 1980s, he was murdered, and not in any ordinary way. He had gotten mixed up with some drug dealers, and when one of their big operations got busted, they thought he had tipped someone off. Whether that was true or not, I do not know. But those guys believed it. For reasons no one really understands, they used a sword. A weapon like the one I had inherited. It was a brutal, violent death. And my mother had to go to the morgue and identify what was left of him. I found all of this out when I was about 16. My mom still would not say much about it back then. Years later, when she finally did talk to me about it, she said her brother was not really a dealer. He was just trying to earn some extra cash by connecting people who liked to party with people who sold drugs. Now that I am around the same age he was when it happened, I can kind of understand. He probably thought it was harmless. Just making a little money, not thinking it could cost him his life. The night everything changed next door. I was just a little kid when this all happened, so I will admit my memory is a bit fuzzy. But the story itself is real. I grew up in a quiet town near the coast. We had neighbors living next door who I absolutely adored. My parents got along great with them, and their kids were right around my age. We spent a lot of time together, just playing and being kids. Everything about them felt warm and safe. Then, out of the blue, they were gone. No goodbye. No warning. Just gone. I remember seeing police cars at their place, and, maybe a week or two later, moving vans pulling up. After that, nothing. It was as if they had vanished. I was around 5 years old at the time, and when I asked my mom what happened, she told me the kid's grandmother had fallen very sick. Said the police had come to break the news, and the family had to leave in a hurry to take care of her. They never came back. As a kid, that explanation made perfect sense to me. It was only years later, after I had grown up and moved far away from that neighborhood, that I learned what had really happened. One evening, my folks and I were sitting around, just talking about the old days, and I brought up that family. I asked if they had ever heard from them again, or knew what became of them. That is when my mom finally told me the truth. The parents had gone out that night for a date. They left their children at home with a 14-year-old babysitter. While they were gone, someone broke into the house. The babysitter was attacked and murdered. My mom said the police believed she had pretended to be home alone, probably to protect the kids from harm. It was an incredibly brave thing to do. When the parents came home, they found her dead. Somehow, the children were still safe. They made sure the kids were okay and got them back to sleep. Then the police arrived. Once the kids were out cold, the parents wrapped them in blankets, covered their heads, and carried them out of the house. They asked the officers to keep quiet, not wanting to wake or scare the kids. After that, they stuck to the same story they had told me, that grandma was sick and they were moving in with her to help out. Even the grandmother went along with it, playing her role perfectly for a few weeks while the parents searched for a new place to live. They did not want their kids growing up with the memory of what had happened just a few feet away from where they slept. I do not know if those kids ever learned the truth. Maybe they did. Maybe they are still out there thinking it was all about a sick grandmother. The wreck on the ridge. When I turned 21, my grandfather sat me down and shared a family story I had never heard before. It was about his older brother, my great-uncle, and it hit me harder than I expected. Now, my great-uncle was known for hitting the bottle pretty hard for most of his life. He lived to be 92 somehow, even though he drank for decades and smoked like a chimney. Toward the end, he switched to just beer and wine, and he had cut back to 1 pack of cigarettes a day after losing half a lung. He and my grandfather grew up working a farm back in the 1930s and 1940s. The family mostly kept the place running by themselves, but every now and then they would bring in a wandering laborer to help out. Just folks passing through looking for work. In the summer of 1950, my great-uncle was out drinking with one of those hired hands. They were riding back to the farm in his convertible, and he was the one behind the wheel. There was a sharp bend in the road near the farm, with a steep drop-off on one side. He did not handle it right. The car hit the edge, climbed up the embankment, and flipped over. My uncle got thrown clear from the car. The other guy, the drifter, was only part way out when it landed. My grandfather said the man was cut clean in half. The police came, but the man had no family around, no one to come looking. And with the Korean War just starting, my great-uncle managed to join the military and avoid any real consequences. He shipped off to Korea and stayed there until the fighting was done. That was the first and only time I ever heard that story. My grandfather never mentioned it again. I have never been the kind of person to drink and drive, maybe a beer over dinner, sure, but never to the point of being a risk. Still, that story stuck with me. It sits in the back of my mind every time I see someone grab their keys after one too many. Someday, I will tell that same story to my kids, when they are old enough to drive, so they understand just how fast one bad choice can change everything. The fairy tale they told me. Part 6, 2603 letters. Growing up, I always had a sense that things were rocky between my parents. There was yelling, constant tension, and more than once, my dad vanished for a few days to sleep in his car. He drank a lot, too. I never thought they were happy, but whenever I asked why they did not just get divorced, they always gave the same answer: they loved each other too much. And weirdly enough, over the last few years, they seem more relaxed about the whole thing. Now they even laugh about all the messed up things they did to each other, right in front of me. Over time, I started piecing together the real story behind their so-called romance. They met when they were just kids, both 14. At the time, my mom was dating some guy who was 18, and my dad kept pestering her to go out with him instead. He wore her down, and eventually, she left her boyfriend and gave my dad a chance. After school, my mom went off to university. She kept working hard, trying to build a future. Meanwhile, my dad dropped out of college and dove headfirst into partying and drinking. He was living wild while she was busy studying. At one of those parties, he ended up cheating on her with someone they both knew from school. When my mom found out, she ended things. Not even a year later, my dad realized he could not take care of himself. No one else wanted to deal with him, and he came crawling back to her. She agreed to take him back, but only if he promised to marry her down the line. He agreed. By the time they were 22, she was already putting pressure on him to propose. He messed that up too. They were in Paris, and it was her dream to be proposed to near the Eiffel Tower. He forgot the ring and ended up proposing back at the hotel after they had seen the tower. She said yes anyway. Not long after they got married, my mom started pushing for a baby. My dad did not want kids, but she kept pressing. Within a month, she had convinced him, and 9 months later I was born. That is when things really started to fall apart. They realized parenting was harder than it looked and ended up leaving most of the work to my grandparents. After me came 2 more kids, both unplanned. Each time, my dad told her he would leave if she did not get an abortion. She talked him into staying, promising he would not have to raise them. And he did not. But neither did she. I was the one who ended up taking care of them. And that is just the beginning. That was only the part that happened before I even started school. If I kept going, it would take hours to tell the rest. They always made their story sound like some perfect love tale. Childhood sweethearts. Romantic Paris proposal. A family born out of passion. But the truth is, it was a mess of manipulation, guilt, regret, and broken promises. What they called love was just a pile of bad choices dressed up like something beautiful. The fairy tale they told me. Growing up, I always had a sense that things were rocky between my parents. There was yelling, constant tension, And more than once, my dad vanished for a few days to sleep in his car. He drank a lot, too. I never thought they were happy, but whenever I asked why they did not just get divorced, they always gave the same answer: they loved each other too much. And weirdly enough, over the last few years, they seem more relaxed about the whole thing. Now they even laugh about all the messed up things they did to each other, right in front of me. Over time, I started piecing together the real story behind their so-called romance. They met when they were just kids, both 14. At the time, my mom was dating some guy who was 18, and my dad kept pestering her to go out with him instead. He wore her down, and eventually, she left her boyfriend and gave my dad a chance. After school, my mom went off to university. She kept working hard, trying to build a future. Meanwhile, my dad dropped out of college and dove headfirst into partying and drinking. He was living wild while she was busy studying. At one of those parties, he ended up cheating on her with someone they both knew from school. When my mom found out, she ended things. Not even a year later, my dad realized he could not take care of himself. No one else wanted to deal with him, and he came crawling back to her. She agreed to take him back, but only if he promised to marry her down the line. He agreed. By the time they were 22, she was already putting pressure on him to propose. He messed that up too. They were in Paris, and it was her dream to be proposed to near the Eiffel Tower. He forgot the ring and ended up proposing back at the hotel after they had seen the tower. She said yes anyway. Not long after they got married, my mom started pushing for a baby. My dad did not want kids, but she kept pressing. Within a month, she had convinced him, and 9 months later I was born. That is when things really started to fall apart. They realized parenting was harder than it looked and ended up leaving most of the work to my grandparents. After me came 2 more kids, both unplanned. Each time, my dad told her he would leave if she did not get an abortion. She talked him into staying, promising he would not have to raise them. And he did not. But neither did she. I was the one who ended up taking care of them. And that is just the beginning. That was only the part that happened before I even started school. If I kept going, it would take hours to tell the rest. They always made their story sound like some perfect love tale. Childhood sweethearts. Romantic Paris proposal. A family born out of passion. But the truth is, it was a mess of manipulation, guilt, regret, and broken promises. What they called love was just a pile of bad choices dressed up like something beautiful. One punch changed everything. I did not learn this about my grandfather until after he passed away. Growing up, all the older guys in our neighborhood would talk about how tough he was. They made him sound like a legend. And honestly, he looked the part. He was the kind of man that could silence a room just by clearing his throat. I swear, if he sneezed, you would flinch. I am not even kidding. Everyone, men, women, old-timers, younger folks, they all said the same thing: he had never lost a fight. Supposedly, it only took him one punch most of the time. That was it. One shot and whoever was dumb enough to cross him was on the ground. No one messed with him. He was, plain and simple, a bad man to cross. But here is the thing: despite all that, he always told me and my cousins the same thing: do not fight. Ever. Walk away if you can. If someone runs their mouth, just keep going. Words do not hurt unless you let them. He drilled it into our heads that fighting was a last resort. And no matter what, never be the one to start it. That always puzzled me. I mean, how could this man, who supposedly knocked out dozens of people, be so against fighting? I only got the full picture after he died. Turns out that when he was in his 20s, he got into it with some guy who just would not stop provoking him. Trash talk, pushing boundaries, the whole thing. Eventually, my grandfather had enough and let loose. Dropped the guy with one punch. But the guy fell back and smacked his head on a step. It was over right there. He died on the spot. That single punch ended a life, and changed my grandfather's forever. I had never heard a word about it growing up. And when I asked why he never went to prison, the truth finally came out. He did go. He got sentenced, 15, maybe 20 years. But then World War II broke out. Back when I was a kid, I would ask my mom if Grandpa had been drafted or if he signed up on his own. She would always say something like, "It was like the Dirty Dozen." I had no clue what that meant back then. I had never seen the movie. Later on, I figured it out. The military gave him a choice: go fight on the front lines, Japan, and if you survive, your record gets wiped clean. If not, well, too bad. So he went. He fought. He lived. And his past stayed buried, until I learned the truth. Everything he ever told us about not throwing the first punch? It all made sense after that. The priest, the lie, and the man they told me to hate. It was not until after my grandmother passed away that I started digging into the truth, the kind of truth that changes everything you thought you knew about your family. My whole life, I was told that my grandmother had fallen deeply in love with a Catholic priest. That she left her high school sweetheart, the man she had 5 kids with, for this priest. From the stories I grew up hearing, it sounded like one of those rare, once-in-a-lifetime romances. They even had old love letters they wrote to each other while he was stationed overseas, and I remember finding some of those notes, and holding on to them like they were proof of something pure. The story was always painted in soft tones. Sweet. Noble. Honest. But it turns out there was a lot more hiding under the surface. I was raised to believe my biological grandfather, my dad's father, was a monster. I was told he abandoned the family. That when my aunt died in a drunk driving accident, he didn't even show up to her funeral. I grew up being encouraged to hate this man, and I never questioned it. I never met him during my childhood, and by the time I did in my 20s, I felt completely numb toward him. Meanwhile, the priest was treated like a saint. He stepped in, raised the kids, bought my grandmother a new home, gave her a Suburban, took them to Hawaii, and even paid for their college. My dad and his siblings always spoke of him with deep respect. He had military benefits that somehow ended up going to my grandmother. He lived what looked like a charmed life, rubbing elbows with celebrities like Bob Hope and traveling all over. But one day, out of sheer curiosity, I decided to look into his past. I just wanted to know if he had any relatives or maybe someone out there who knew about his relationship with my grandmother. So I searched his name. And that is when the bottom fell out. I came across a lawsuit, one of those big ones involving the Catholic Church. His name was on it. At first, I was shocked. Then came the unease. The more I dug, the worse it got. I found a 16-page report, not just listing him among others, but focused entirely on him. It had everything: police reports, church investigations, and testimony. Early in his time as a priest, he had taken in a 14-year-old runaway girl. His explanation made it sound innocent, but the police report suggested otherwise. Still, nothing came of it. The police seemed to take his word. But the deeper I read, the clearer the picture became. There were reports of underage girls showing up at the rectory dressed inappropriately. He was drinking, skipping church duties, and gambling. At one point, he told the church he had been called back into military service, but that turned out to be a lie. He was off drinking and womanizing. Church staff and fellow priests wrote anonymous letters begging for his removal. He got probation, went to rehab, was moved from one parish to another, a cycle we have all heard too often. But the final blow came when I found a summary of his behavior that led to his so-called retirement. That was when I learned the truth about the day he bought the Suburban. He had taken my grandmother and 3 of the kids with him, and that day, he physically assaulted her. He also hit and kicked the kids. That was never part of the story we were told. I cross-checked everything: the timeline, the vehicle, the locations. It all lined up. The Suburban still sits in my uncle's driveway. There was no denying it. I was alone when I found all of this, sitting in silence, trying to process how the man my whole family had idolized was in fact the worst kind of fraud. And I began to question everything. Did my dad know? I asked him once if he had ever looked into it, and he said yes, that he had seen the lawsuit. But I do not know if he dug as far as I did. I have not asked? I am afraid of the answer. If he did know all of this and never told me, that feels like betrayal. If he did not know, then my heart breaks for what he and his siblings were put through. It also changed how I see my grandmother. She left a man, my biological grandfather, who had come to the church with suspicions. He believed she was having an affair with the priest. And she was. I had always hated him for supposedly abandoning the family, but now I wonder what he was really going through. Maybe he was pushed away. Maybe he could not bring himself to face the man who had stolen his wife, raised his children, and then stood at the altar to bury his daughter. The whole thing makes my chest heavy. The man I was told to despise might have been heartbroken, not heartless. And the man I was taught to admire turned out to be someone I do not know how to even speak about. What was once my grandma fell in love with a priest has now become something else entirely, confusing, painful, and far more human than I ever expected. The priest, the lie, and the man they told me to hate. Back in the 90s, both my grandma and my uncle were diagnosed with cancer. My uncle managed to beat it, and went into remission, but grandma wasn't so lucky, she passed away. Fast forward almost 10 years, and my uncle's cancer came back aggressively. By that time, he'd been with his partner for over 40 years, and the two of them had become serious hoarders. My mom, his sister, lived a couple of hours away, so she didn't really know how bad things had gotten until she went to help care for him. After that first visit, it was clear just how bad the house was, so the rest of us made multiple trips to help clean up the mess. One of those days, my uncle's partner mentioned that he needed to check the P.O. box since they hadn't grabbed their mail in a while. My mom offered to drive him over. When they came back and started going through the mail, she noticed a letter from the IRS addressed to my grandmother. That threw her off. Grandma had been gone nearly a decade. Why would she be getting mail from the IRS? That's when everything came to light. Turns out my uncle and grandma had a joint bank account, and after she died, he never told anyone, no death certificate, no notice to the government. Because of that, her government pension from my grandpa kept getting direct deposited like nothing had happened. For nearly 10 years, he'd been collecting checks under her name. But it didn't stop there. He had also racked up a ton of credit card debt, cards in her name and his, and maxed them all out. He knew his cancer was terminal this time around, and instead of making peace or cleaning things up, he decided to spend whatever money he could while he still had time. How my dad got his incredible nose. My dad grew up in a small, working-class town in eastern Ukraine, and honestly, we didn't have much money for most of our lives. But one thing always stood out: my mom would constantly praise my dad's incredible sense of smell. He could recognize perfumes instantly, even expensive or rare ones, and often name them just by scent. It always impressed people. When I was in my 20s, I finally asked him how he picked up such a specific skill. At first, he hesitated, then leaned in and said, "Promise me you'll never tell your mother." Then he told me this. Back in the Soviet days, he had a close childhood friend, someone he'd known forever, who turned out to be the secret lover of one of the most famous Soviet singers at the time. This singer was publicly married but was privately gay, and he quietly supported the underground LGBTQ community. He would travel abroad and smuggle back things that were almost impossible to get in the USSR, things like new music, fashion, and high-end perfumes. These perfumes would show up at private parties, not gay parties, just underground hangouts for counterculture youth, and my dad was often there. His friend would share the perfumes with him, and over time, my dad developed a nose for them. That same friend would also bring back Western vinyl records, brand new releases, and he and my dad had a little side hustle. They'd sell the records under the table and split the money. That's why my dad still knows so much about music from the 60s and 70s. He remembers what came out when, probably better than most people who lived in the West during that time. He also told me about a particular square in Sochi, where the 2014 Olympics were later held, where, back then, gay men in the Soviet Union would discreetly meet. He even knew the secret signs they used to recognize each other. Now, just to clarify, my dad's friend was the only gay person he really knew. And his friend's sexuality was a tightly guarded secret. Those parties weren't gay parties. They were just normal gatherings of rebellious youth. People were always curious where his friend was getting all that cool Western stuff, but he never told anyone, except for my dad, because they were basically like family. And hey, even if my dad did have some wild experiences back then, honestly, I think it's kinda great to know. Makes life more interesting.